Today we are resuming our regular program of stories of the early days in the Kootenays and interviews with old-timers. Music, or new, will be added for variety. As water transportation was the first and only means of travel between many parts of the Kootenay district in the early days, we are resuming our historical series with an article which appeared in the Cominco magazine, January 1943. This is a story of 77 years of steamboating. That means going back 95 years to 1865. But I would ask you to remember that the article was written in the tense of 1943. And now 17 years have gone by. The name of the article is Shallow Draft, and the author was W. Gibson Kennedy of Trail, who admitted that his story demanded 6 months of spare time preparation. The author's note reads, "Credit for the main source of information contained in this record of the picturesque stern-wheeler is due to Captain James Fitzsimmons, who was, for 38 years, ship's master in the steamer service on the lakes. Captain Fitzsimmons came west from Nova Scotia, where he had worked on the boats between that province and Prince Edward Island. He was bound for the Yukon, but, like many others, stayed in the Kootenays, where he was soon working at his old trade. He retired in February 1935. The captain will be best remembered by Benny as the representative of the Cas-au-Slocan in the British Columbia government of 1928 and 1932. We are deeply indebted to Mr. Craig Weir, editor of the Cominco magazine, who has given us permission to use articles appearing in his publication. Our story today is the first installment of one of these articles. Here is a story of steamboating on the lakes and rivers of interior British Columbia, a story which will bring back pleasant memories to many an old-timer and possibly a little sadness. It is a record of the pioneer days of the interior's water transportation system, dating back as far as 1865, when the first stern-wheel steamboat plied the waters of the mighty Columbia, carrying men and materials to the gold rush in the Big Bend above Revelstoke. The first steamer ever to attempt the hazardous route of the Columbia was the Little 49, built in 1865 at a point just south of the boundary by Captain Leonard White, a famous pioneer pilot who had taken the first steamers up the uncharted Snake, Willamette, and Columbia rivers to our south. The Little 49 was launched on November 18, 1865, and left Colville, Washington, on her first journey northward on December the 9th that same year. She was powered by the engines of the old Jenny Clark, the first stern-wheel steamer in the Pacific Northwest, built in 1854. The 49 did not get far on her first trip, for she encountered ice on the Our Lakes and did not succeed in getting through until April 1866, when she reached the foot of Death Rapids above Revelstoke. The gold rush in the Big Bend did not last, however, and after her third trip, the 49 carried only southbound passengers, many of whom could not pay their fares, and it became evident that the little steamer was doomed to a short life. And so began the history of steamboating in British Columbia. 20 years later, in the early 80s, activity in the Kootenays revived. The Canadian Pacific to the north and the Great Northern to the south were constructing to the west coast. The Kootenays were being opened up and its rich resources uncovered. And with this came the advent of a busy and prosperous time for the interior. But there were no railways and no highways. Again, the necessity for transportation saw the construction and operation of the little catamaran Dispatch, built at Revelstoke by 3 well-known pioneers of Kootenay, Fred Hume, William Cowan, and Captain Sanderson, who organized the Columbia Transportation Company. The Dispatch was intended to run from Revelstoke to the boundary in an effort to capture for Canadians some of the trade of the South Kootenay, which was almost entirely in the hands of the Americans. The success of the Dispatch encouraged its owners to construct a larger and swifter vessel, one which would run all the rapids of the Columbia, up to the impassable Death Rapids, north of Revelstoke. So, in December 1889, at Revelstoke, the keel was laid for a fine stern wheeler, the Lytton. In order to build the new ship, the Columbia Transportation Company had found it necessary to form the Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company. Taking into its fold the influential shareholder J.A. Mara, who had operated steamers on Kamloops Lake, Captain John Irving, well known in BC coast shipping, and Frank Barnard, later Sir Frank, of Barnard's Express. The new organization had a capital of $100,000, and over a period of a few years was to have the finest fleet of steamers ever to ply the waters of the Columbia and the Kootenay. The Lytton was launched in May 1890 and cost her owners some $40,000. She was 131 feet long, 25.5 feet beam, and about 125 tons, and capable of 12.5 miles per hour. She drew steam up 19 inches of water, or with a 60-ton load, 2.5 feet forward and 26 inches amidships. She made her first trip July the 2nd, 1890, under Captain Frank Oden. Alec Lindquist, mate, and George E. Tunstall, purser, with a passenger list which included W.C. Van Horn and other Canadian Pacific officials. A little over a month later, August the 13th, she attempted her first trip south of Robson to the Little Dalles, going down river in 2.5 hours, but taking 6 hours to battle her way up. To assist the Lytton, the steamer Kootenay was purchased, which had been built below the boundary in 1885 to carry the traffic offering north of the railway construction in the Selkirks. She had not been in use for some time and was tied up at the Little Dalles. She was 140 feet long and of 200 tons, but not as powerful as the Lytton. She was speedier, however, and was put on the 150-mile run from Robson to Revelstoke, while the Lytton handled the trip from Robson south to Little Dalles, where she connected with the newly constructed Spokane Falls and Northern Railway, a subsidiary of the Great Northern. The newly formed Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company paid $10,000 in promissory notes for the new Kootenay, and she paid for herself in a few trips. The Lytton and the Kootenay, like her predecessors and sister ships to follow, were flat-bottomed boats, drawing only a few inches of water. She drew as little as 22 inches, while few exceeded 3 or 4 feet. The Lytton and the Kootenay proved successful, plying the Arrow Lakes all year round, running south to Little Dalles when the water permitted. During low water, the steamer Marion, owned by Captain Sanderson, connected with the larger steamers at Arrowhead and completed the trip to Revelstoke. As we have already seen, the Spokane Falls and Northern had reached the Little Dalles. This was in 1890. In the same year, the Canadian Pacific bought the Columbia and Kootenay Railway and pushed forward construction of the line from Robson to Nelson, completing the line in 1892. This was the first access by rail to the Kootenay Lake, and now gave a connection from the Columbia to the Kootenay. Shortly after this, the Great Northern reached Bonner's Ferry, Idaho, on the Kootenay River, later building to Kuskonook on Kootenay Lake. And in 1895, the Spokane Falls and Northern, under the name of the Nelson and Fort Shepherd Railway, reached Nelson. The linking of the Kootenays with the outside through the various railways brought added prosperity to the district, and with this increased traffic for the boats. To handle this increasing business, the Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company added 2 new steamers to the fleet in 1891. The Columbia, a stern wheeler with the length of 125 feet and a width of 38, and the Nelson, 134.4 feet, 26.5 beam, and 406 tons, by far the largest steamer on the inland lakes. The Columbia was for the Arrow Lakes and the Columbia was for the Arrow Lakes and Columbia River route, while the Nelson marked entrance of the CKSN company into the Kootenay Lake trade. The Columbia was built by Alexander Watson at Little Dalles, Washington, at a cost of $75,000. She entered the service in August 1891 and was placed under the command of Captain John C. Gore, and proved to be a reliable and successful craft. The Nelson was built at Nelson, launched in June 1891, and put into service in August. She was placed under the command of Captain McMorris, who had been on the Dispatch and the Lytton on the Columbia. The role of the Nelson was to capture some of the outward-bound Kootenay trade, diverting it to Nelson and thence by the Columbia and Kootenay Railway to Robson and up the Arrow Lakes to the main line of the Canadian Pacific, which by this time had been completed. The Nelson was the first stern wheeler on the Kootenay Lake, the only other boats being hardly more than steam launches, such as the Midge, brought from Europe in 1884 by W.A. Bailey Groman, to be used in connection with the land reclamation project. The Midge crossed the Atlantic on the deck of the Polynesian and was classified by the customs as an agricultural instrument, thus escaping duty fees. Other steamers prior to the Nelson were the Idaho, brought over land in much the same manner as the Midge, and the Surprise, built by Dr. Hendricks, Kootenay Mining and Smelting Company, to haul supplies to the Bluebell Mine. In 1888, this company built the famous steamer Galena, a larger craft, and the first designed for the passenger traffic then offering. She was a twin screw boat, 80 feet long and 16 feet wide. The Galena sank at Pilot Bay in a heavy gale 6 years later, but was raised and remained afloat until 1897, when her hull was found to be beyond repair. Her engines were installed by Hiram Sweet, who had come into the district with the Idaho, and who later was chief engineer on many of the Kootenay Lake steamers. She was the first command of Captain George Hayward, for many years senior captain on Kootenay Lake. For some time, the Nelson had for her only competition the steamer Galena, but in 1892 a second rival in the form of an 84 screw steamer Ainsworth appeared. She was a reliable boat built by Messrs. Dave Bramer, Jack Watson, and a man named Jevons, and ran until 1897, when she too went down in a storm. She was raised, however, refitted and put into service, lasting only about a year, when she sank at Balfour with a loss of 9 lives, November the 29th, 1898. In the meantime, in 1892, the Great Northern Railway entered the picture with the launching of the steamer Caslow and a number of barges. In the spring of 1893, a large stern wheeler, the State of Idaho, also built by the Great Northern, with the intention of outstripping the Nelson, was launched at Bonner's Ferry for the Kootenay Lake service. She was 140 feet long, 23 feet wide, and a faster boat than the Canadian steamer. Her skipper was Captain W. Shaw. Her career was brief, however, for that same year she ran ashore on the rocks near Ainsworth in a fog and was declared a total wreck. She was sold practically on the spot to a Calgary man, G. Alexander, for $350. She was towed to Caslow, where she lay submerged for many months, but was raised and refitted in 1895, renamed the Alberta, and assigned to the Nelson Caslow run. To the Nelson, the C&K SN added the steamer Spokane in 1892, She was of 400 tons gross, 125 feet long, and was built at Bonner's Ferry. She too was short-lived, being destroyed by fire at Caslow, where she was undergoing tests and repairs, preparatory to being recommissioned, after serving as a floating wharf when the floods of 1894 had washed away the town pier. She was chiefly a freighter and had cost her owners about $15,000. The Nelson replaced her on her run, and to take over the Nelson's work, the steamer Kootenay was built. This boat was 142 feet long and 24.8 feet in width. The new boat was a fast one, and on her trial in May 1896 covered 12 miles in 40 minutes. In order to compete with the new steamer, the Great Northern built the Sternwheeler International. The old-time races on Kootenay Lake were renewed. On her trial, no effort was made by the Kootenay or the International to outdo each other, but on November the 21st, the two boats met and the Canadian steamer won. Today we are relating the second installment of Shallow Draft by W. Gibson Kennedy, a story of steamboating in the Kootenays that began in 1865. Our first installment brought us up to 1896, when the steamers Kootenay and International provided such interesting competition. By this time, steamboating had become a private enterprise, as can be judged by the number of boats making their appearance on the lakes and rivers. The surrounding districts had given forth numerous mines, and a number of small smelters had to come into operation to handle the ores. The boundary country was opening up, the Slocan to become rich in silver, and before the close of the century the southern interior was to be recognized as an important mining district. All this required transportation chiefly by water, since the railways had not yet amounted to only short lines, serving to connect the great waterways. In 1894, the mineral output of the Kootenay amounted to $781,000. By 1898, it was nearly $6,500,000. Rivalry between the Americans and the Canadian Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company was becoming keener. The Nelson and Fort Shepherd Railway was completed to Nelson in 1895, giving an outlet to Spokane to the Great Northern. The C&KSN had persuaded Captain James W. Troop, an experienced steamboat man who had been in charge of the Union Pacific fleet of riverboats on the Lower Columbia, to take over the management of the interior fleet. This post he held until 1898, when he transferred to Vancouver to take charge of the Canadian Pacific Coastal Fleet. Under Captain Troop's direction, the C&KSN added to the Columbia River Fleet in 1892 the steamer Illecillevat, a sort of steam scow. She was a stern-wheeler with a very shallow draft, and it was often said that she could run over sandbars without wetting them. Rather far-fetched, but it was true she could run over the numerous boomsticks in the river. She was powered by the engines of the old catamaran Dispatch, and was used chiefly as a freighter. The Illecillevat was designed by Captain Troop and was his favorite steamer. He often used her to survey river conditions during low water. She was the only steamer which could give a year-round service between Trail and Northport, when, during low water, every other steamer was forced off the run. She proved highly successful and served her owners well, and hauled many tons of ore from the Leroy mine to Rossland to the smelter at Northport. In October 1893, a small screw steamer, the Arrow, was launched at Revelstoke for Captain C.W. Vandenberg. This small steamer played a great part in keeping the river channels open north to Revelstoke, but in December 1895, capsized in a sudden storm between Bannock Point and the river mouth, with the loss of her two-man crew, Captain Vandenberg and her engineer. Her hull was later found floating bottom up, and she was righted and taken over to Slocan Lake, where she served for several years. Things up to this time had gone well with the navigation company, but in 1894-95 it was to lose two of our finest ships. The Columbia, lying at a woodpile just south of the boundary, was burned by fire in the early morning of August 2nd, 1894. She was loaded with an excursion party and was under the command of Captain Gore. Her loss was followed by the Spokane, which, as mentioned before, burned at Caslow. The Columbia played an important part in carrying American settlers north, headed for the Canadian prairies, and on one occasion had as a passenger, in 1893, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination precipitated the War of 1914-18. The Archduke traveled on the Columbia from Revelstoke to Robson in the course of his coming-of-age round the world tour. Of interest, too, is the fact that Captain J. Anderson, at the time purser on the Columbia, installed at Revelstoke what may have been the first ship-to-shore telephone. The offices of the C&K-SN at Revelstoke were some distance from the wharf, and the phone was installed in order to save time. The fleet was now reduced to 3 ships, the Lytton, the Kootenay, and the Nelson, as far as large passenger ships were concerned. A building program was therefore necessary, and in 1895 and 1896 construction commenced on 3 new steamers, the first, the Nakusp, the largest steamer ever built up to that time for the lake and river service. Captain Troup designed her, and she was built by David Bulger of Nakusp, BC. Bulger had come to the west from Newfoundland and had spent some time in Portland, and like many other famous steamboatmen, was persuaded to come to the Kootenays by Captain Troup. The Nakusp was launched on Dominion Day 1895 and was 171 feet long, 33 feet wide, and had 6 feet of hold. She was 3-decked, had 33 staterooms, and a double-deck dining room, like that which many will remember so well on the large Bonington and her sister ships, the Sidmouth of Okanagan Lake and the Nasukan of the Kootenay Lake, which followed several years later. The Nakusp ran from Arrowhead to Trail, but her life was short. She grounded on the Kootenay Flats south of Castlegar, September 8, 1897, while running to Trail, but was raised and floated and again plying her way towards the end of October. However, she, like her predecessor, the Columbia, met her end by fire at Arrowhead, December the 23rd, 1897. The Nakusp had been joined by 2 more vessels, the tug Columbia and the stern-wheeler freighter Trail. The Trail was a big boat, 165 feet long, with a beam of 31 feet, and was designed for freight and barge work, serving until she too was destroyed by fire at West Robson in 1902. The building of the new tug Columbia and the freighter Trail marked a new branch of service on the waterways. The building of the Caslow and Nakusp Railway, serving Sandon mining districts and connecting Caslow and Nakusp and the Arrowhead branch, necessitated huge box-carrying barges. In the years to follow, the tug and its car-laden barge was to become a familiar sight on the lakes, barges carrying as many as 34 cars. Even today, tugs and their accompanying barges may be seen on the Kootenay, Slocan, and Okanagan lakes. At this time, about 1896, the smelters at Trail and Nelson were operating, and they depended on the lake and the riverboats for their coal and supplies. The Canadian Pacific was looming into the scene, and was experiencing difficulty in reaching the mining districts of the Kootenay. So, in 1896, it is not surprising to learn that the great railway company completed the purchase of all the holdings of the Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company for nearly $200,000. The purchase included 7 steamers, 10 barges, shops, and other equipment. In 1898, the Canadian Pacific took over the smelter at Trail and the narrow-gauge Columbia and Western Railway, which connected Trail and Rossland. The line was extended to Robson, the branch from Trail to Rossland standardized. The railway company also completed their line through the Crow's Nest Pass to Kootenay Landing on Kootenay Lake. The Canadian Pacific, at the time it took over the C&K-SN, contracted for 3 new stern-wheelers. 2 were for the Arrow Lake service, and the third, the Slocan, was for Slocan Lake. The 2 new Arrow Lake boats were the Rossland and the Kootenay. and the latter built to replace the old Kootenay, which was to be dismantled. She had gone down at Cottonwood Island, south of Wigwam, on December the 2nd, 1895, was raised and towed to Nakusp, where she lay for some time of no further use. The old Kootenay had carried the first shipments of ore north from Trail and the Slocan. The Rossland, 183 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 884 tons, was the finest and fastest boat at that time on the lakes, the only steamer that could make the run north from Trail without assistance over the worst rapids. The Kootenay, resembling the old Nakusp, was 183.5 feet long, had a tonnage of 1,117, and a beam of 32.6 feet. The Slocan was the smallest of the three steamers, being only 155 feet long. The Rossland, on one of her trial trips, made the run from Arrowhead to Nakusp in 1 hour and 40 minutes, at a speed of a little more than 20 miles per hour. Her fuel consumption at this pace was so great, however, that only under extreme circumstances did she ever maintain so great a speed. The Kootenay, on the other hand, made the run from Arrowhead to Trail and return on as little as 18 tons of coal. This was made possible by slow steaming over that portion of the run covered by night. The new boats were built by David Bulger at Nakusp, under design of Captain Troop, and were engined by Dave Stevens, who installed the engines of practically all the larger steamers later added to the fleet. At the same time the company built the Slocan, they bought the screw steamer William Hunter, the pioneer craft of Slocan Lake, which had been operating since 1894. In 1898, the tug Sandon was added to the Slocan fleet, and she and the Slocan remained in service until 1927, when a new tug, the Rosebery, was launched, and the two older boats dismantled. The Rosebery is to be replaced in 1943 by the new Rosebery, the first ship to be added to the lake and river fleet in about 14 years. The Kootenay, Rossland, and Nakusp together provided an efficient service from Arrowhead to the south, until the Nakusp was burned in 1897. She was replaced by the steamer Minto in 1898, who, with her sister ship, the Moyie of Kootenay Lake, had been built in Toronto and shipped west, intended for the Stikine River. The gold rush at that part of British Columbia died out before the steamers reached their destination, and they were rerouted from Vancouver to the Arrow Lakes and the Kootenay Lakes, respectively, where, strangely enough, they were the only stern wheelers the Canadian Pacific have in operation today. The Minto and her sister were the first steel-hulled boats on the lake. She was lengthened by the 20-foot section, giving her a total length of 161.7 feet, her beam 30.1, and tonnage 830. The Moyie and the Minto have the same specifications and are almost identical in appearance, with the exception of the top deck cabin, which the Minto now extends to the rear of the deck. The Minto was assembled at Nakusp and the Moyie at Nelson. That ends the second installment and brings us up to 1898 in the story of steamboating on the Kootenays. I was on the SS Moyie when it was launched. The event was quite a gala affair, with a large assembly in attendance and a select group of officials and other citizens on board the steamer Kootenay, I think it was, which was standing by to return the Moyie to the ways for the finishing touches. The shipyards then were about a mile below the CPR station in Nelson. As I said, I was on the Moyie, and as a boy of 11, I was everywhere, and usually where I shouldn't be. As the Moyie was sliding down the ways, I got in the way of one of the men handling the lines. He caught me by the seat of the pants and tossed me towards the door of the boiler room. At the same instant, the boat hit the water and added impetus to my skidding on the smooth steel deck. However, nothing more serious happened, although there have been some bad accidents by getting tangled up with ropes. Today we are reading the third and final installment of Shallow Draft. The History of Steamboats on the Kootenay and Columbia River Systems, written by W. Gibson Kennedy and published in the Cominco magazine, January 1943. Our second installment ended with the launching of the Minto and Moyie in 1898. So we continue from there, remembering that this article was written in 1943, 17 years ago. Now we continue with the story. In 1898, the CPR placed in service on Kootenay Lake the tug Weimer. She was joined in 1901 by the Valhalla, in 1909 by the Hosmer, which remained in operation until the Kootenay Landing Proctor link was completed in 1931. These tugs handled on the average of 4 15-car barges daily between Proctor and Kootenay Landing. In 1909, the tug Watson was built to handle a similar service between Nakusp and Arrowhead. The Watson was dismantled in 1920 and her engines installed in the tug Kelowna on Okanagan Lake. In 1906, the company built the stern wheeler Kuskonook at Nelson to join the Moyie, which had been launched in 1898. The Kuskonook was a wooden steamer, 193.5 feet long and 1,008 tons, and up to that time the largest boat on Kootenay Lake. In 1913, a steel-hulled boat of 1,896 tons and 200 feet long was launched. This fine stern wheel steamer was christened Nasukan, and fittingly too, for Nasukan was the Indian word for Queen of the Lakes. She was a sister to the Bonington, which had been built and placed in service in the Arrow Lakes. The Bonington was built at Nakusp in 1911, was 202.5 feet in length and 1,700 tons gross. Her first crew, as a matter of interest, consisted of Captain L.H. Fraser, Master, W. Fraser, First Officer, A. Thompson, Second Officer, W.H. Davies, Purser, W.H. Nichols, Freight Clerk, J. Fife, Chief Engineer, J. Johnson, Second Engineer, and J. Dan, Steward. The Bonington was for the Arrowhead Robson West run, and in later years made the trip 3 times a week, running opposite the Minto. This new ship, like her sister ships on Okanagan and Kootenay Lakes, had compound engines, which developed 1,200 horsepower and were very economical to operate. Some idea of the size of her engines may be gained by the fact that the piston rods were 24 feet in length. The Bonington and her sister ships were the pride of the fleet, and the largest ships ever to run on the inland waters. They had double-deck dining rooms, luxurious observation rooms forward, smoking rooms aft, and comfortable staterooms. In 1901, the steamer Revelstoke was built at Revelstoke by design of Captain Troop and supervised by David Bulger, under the ownership of a private company, with the late Frank McCarty as president. She was designed for the run north to LaPorte, wintering at Comiplex when low water and ice prevented her plying so far north. She was a big ship, 125 feet long, with a beam of 22.5 feet. The Revelstoke drew only 22 inches of water, light draft, had a load capacity of 50 tons, carried 200 pounds steam pressure, and was electrically lighted and cost $25,000. This vessel ran the dangerous rapids in the narrow canyon of the Columbia until 1915, when fire destroyed her while she was tied up at Comiplex. During her useful and hazardous life, she was under Captain Albert Forsland and Henry Colbeck, engineer. Since the passing of this gallant ship, the waters of the upper Columbia have been left, as far as transportation is concerned. With the dawn of the 20th century, it became evident that the steamers would be gradually replaced by the railway. The Canadian Pacific had completed its line to Trail in the early 1900s, and the steamers no longer ran south of Robson. The CPR was operating its branch from Revelstoke to Arrowhead and the Slocan Railway. The line from Robson to Nelson now connected with the line to Trail. and the Great Northern had completed its branches up into British Columbia from its main line to the south. However, it was not until 1916, when the Kettle Valley was completed, that the Kootenays west of the Kootenay Lake and the Boundary Company to the west depended in part on the Arrow Lakes route to reach the coast. The Great Northern boats left the Kootenay Lake in the early 1900s, and the Canadian Pacific Railway was left with the lake to itself. Over on the Arrow Lakes, the march of progress was gradually ringing a death knell for the steamers there, too, and one by one they dropped off the list. The Lytton was dismantled in 1903, the Roslyn sank at Nakusp and was subsequently dismantled in 1918. A few years before she was dismantled, the Roslyn made one last trip down the river to Trail, to carry an excursion party from Trail and Rossland up to Deer Park. She was possibly the first ship to journey to Trail for several years, and probably the last. The Kootenay became the houseboat for Captain Sanderson of the old Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company in 1920, and lay on the shore at Nakusp until she burned in 1942. The Kootenay Lake steamers were disappearing in much the same fashion, with the Nelson being struck off the list in 1919 and the Kokanee in 1923. Only 3 stern-wheelers remained, eventually, as well as a few tugs. The Nasukan was on the Kootenay landing run, the Kuskonook on the Kasla run, and the Moyie handled the freight and odd jobs. In 1931, on completion of the railway link between Kootenay Landing and Proctor, the Nasukan was sold to the British Columbia government and the Kuskonook dismantled. On the Arrow Lakes, the only remaining boats were the Bonington, the Minto, and the Old Columbia, which was completely rebuilt into a screw steamer, Columbia, in 1922. During low water period, the Columbia now handles the traffic on the lower lake, while the Minto plies the upper lake, when neither steamer can pass through the narrows at Burton. To those who know the Columbia, it may be interesting to learn that she draws 14 feet of water, in comparison to the 4 feet of her much larger companion, the Minto. In 1942, the Bonington, having been out of service since 1929, was sold to the British Columbia government, who bought the Nasukan in 1931 and rebuilt her for the ferry service on Kootenay Lake. The boiler of the Bonington was installed in the Nasukan this year, and it had been rumored that a Vancouver firm intends buying the Bonington for her value as scrap. And so, rather quickly and quietly, the steamers disappeared, either by burning or by being dismantled of no further use. But even today, the stern-wheelers maintain an important link in the commerce of the Kootenays, although in a very small scale. The stern-wheeler Moyie makes the trip once a week from Proctor to Kaslo and Lardo, and the Minto, except for low water, makes 2 trips weekly between Robson West and Arrowhead. In the spring of 1942, the old Minto, in service 44 years and with well over 1 million miles behind her, was given a thorough overhauling and is serviceable for another 10 years. Possibly she will be running many years after that period has expired, long after her newer companions have become mere memories. The Minto, under the command of Captain Walter Wright, carries on today in much the same way as the steamers did half a century ago, landing at the regular ports of call or running up on some sandy beach to let off a lonely farmer or prospector. Or perhaps she will wedge herself up on the shore to load 200 or 300 boxes of fruit and take as long as 10 or 15 minutes to work her way off. It's a thrill even today to travel by the steamer up the Arrow Lakes, through a land of scenic beauty unsurpassed anywhere in British Columbia. The narrows joining the upper and lower lakes are extremely swift, and sandbars lie waiting. It seems anxious to catch the old steamer, and at times she must be stopped and reversed to try another run between the bars. And so, now almost gone is the rhythmic beat of the paddle wheel and the sound of the deep-throated steamboat whistle. There remain only 2 old stern-wheelers and relics of the old wharves and snubbing posts. Reminders of the past may be seen at Trail, Janelle, and Castlegar, where rotted posts which once aided the steamers up the swift rapids still stand. At East Robson, on the north end of the level stretch of highway between the ferry and the packing house, over which travelled the trains of the old Columbia and Kootenay Railway, may be seen the old cribbing and ties where the railway went down to the water's edge to connect with the steamers. Only these things remain, symbols of an earlier day. The great white stern-wheel steamer, with its black-topped orange funnel, and the checkered house flag of the Canadian Pacific Steamship Fleet, is nearly a thing of the past. We have come to the end of Mr. Kennedy's article, Shallow Draft, written 17 years ago. Both the Minto and the Moyie have now ceased to operate. The railways and truck lines have taken their toll. The Minto is beached out at Galena Bay across the upper Arrow Lake from Arrowhead, probably destined as a museum. The Moyie lives on, birthed at Caslow, serving as a museum and as a reminder of the romantic steamboating days of the Kootenays. As a tribute to the Moyie, we have two poems that were published in the Nelson Daily News at the time of the retirement of the Moyie. The first poem is composed by Alan Perron. The Moyie. Gallant, nosy little ship, poking into every slip, no other craft, however fine, can take the place that's rightly thine along the lake. Always ready, fussing, eager, she takes her place in time's own wake. Always clean and nice and tidy, she firmly ranks Lady of the Lake. Who of all her many friends can bear to find her still, no longer able to welcome her or hearken to her whistle o'er the hill, now silent on the lake? I could write of the hills of pines, of tamaracks and firs, of beauty that is unsurpassed, but when it comes to grace, they cannot take her place along the lake. Be thankful all, she's spared the shame, the hurt of wrecker's hammer, her deck and hull not torn apart, amid unearthly clamor, along the lake. To all who write of this great lake, of history-making Kootenay beauty, you will find you cannot take from this fine ship of faithful duty her title, Lady of the Lake. Our second poem is composed by Frank Surina of Sidmouth, BC. The accompaniment of the Moyie's own whistle in action and the throbbing of her engines have been developed from tape recordings made by Mr. Valentine of Argenta. We might explain about the steamboat whistles of the early days. When a steamer is due to leave port, she gives 3 whistles, a half-hour previous to departure, to call her passengers. She gives a second warning of 2 whistles at the quarter hour and a short toot when she casts off her lines. Then you will hear the throb of the engines as they labor to gain headway. When arriving at port, the steamer will give 1 long whistle. We will endeavor to duplicate this entire action while reading the next poem by Frank Surina. Here is the boat preparing to leave Nelson. Now here is Mr. Surina's poem. The Moyie. There's a ship nestled closely in the harbour, encircled by the enchantment of the town. Caslow dearly loves the dream they gave her, the Moyie, queen of inland seas. Just let me go aboard the Moyie and sail once more long Kootenay lakes. Let me see the glittering lights of Nelson, but sail me back to Caslow's Emerald Bay. On moonlight nights, take me to the lardo. I'm certain she is with me there. We'll make a call to Ainsworth's thermal city, but sail me back to Caslow's Emerald Bay. I want to see the sun-kissed beach at Proctor. Or let me play under Mirror Lake's starry skies. Dear God, I have one wish. Will you please grant me? Just sail me back to Caslow's Emerald Bay. And there you have my humble efforts to be producer, sound man, and narrator, all rolled into one. We apologize for the shortcomings, but it's all in the fun of making up this program. To those unaware of the fact, the whistle of the Moyie may be heard daily from its new home at the mill of the Kootenay Forest Products Limited in Nelson. And so we salute the SS Moyie and the other fine boats which added so much convenience to the early residents of the Kootenay and Columbia River valleys, and glamour to the history of the Kootenays. We will be including the boats of the Slocan Lake, Trout Lake, and of the East Kootenay in a future broadcast on steamboating. Before the advent of picture shows, cars, and highways, people were entertained by simple things, mostly by those of their own initiative. It used to be a very popular pastime for couples to wander down to the city wharf in the cool of the evening to watch the Crow boat come in and unload. Especially on Sundays, the city wharf would be crowded to capacity. It must have been a heartwarming spectacle for incoming passengers. And so we have completed our reference to the boats on the Kootenay and Columbia River basins. Fleming Recordings hopes you have enjoyed this series. Our grateful thanks goes to Mr. Craig Weir, editor of Cominco magazine, for permission to use his copy, and we thoroughly appreciate the work of W. Gibson Kennedy for his exhaustive work in preparing Shallow Draft. We have also kind remembrances to our late Nelson and District old-time member, Captain James Fitzsimmons, who supplied much of the information.